In the autumn of 2021, the shelves at Target started going empty. Not slowly, the way they do after a storm, all at once. Across the country, toys, electronics, clothing, furniture, just gone. The government called it a supply chain crisis. The media blamed COVID. The shipping companies blamed the ports. The shipping companies were right about the ports. But here's what nobody explained. It wasn't every port that broke. It was 7 of them. 7 specific locations on a map, processing nearly half of everything humanity moves across oceans. When those 7 backed up, the whole system stopped. This is what those 7 ports actually are, how they work, why half the world's economy depends on them, and what happens to you, specifically when one of them has a bad week. Global shipping doesn't work the way most people imagine. It's not ships going from country A to country B with cargo. It's a network, a hub-and-spoke system not unlike an airline. Small regional ports feed cargo to larger transshipment hubs. Those hubs consolidate shipments onto megavessels, and those megavessels connect everything else across open ocean. The 7 ports we're covering aren't simply the busiest. They're the hubs, the nodes, the places where, if something goes wrong, the disruption doesn't stay local. It radiates outward until it reaches a store near you. Remove one, the ripple goes global. Port 1 Shanghai, China. Shanghai moved 47.3 million TEUs in 2023. A TEU is a standard 20-foot shipping container. If you stacked them end to end, they'd reach the moon and back with room to spare. That figure made Shanghai the world's busiest port for the 14th consecutive year. But Shanghai's dominance isn't just about volume, it's about what it exports. More than 40% of China's manufacturing output leaves through Shanghai's Yangshan terminal, a deep-water facility built on an artificial island 12 kilometers offshore because the mainland seabed wasn't deep enough for modern megaships. In 2022, Shanghai went into COVID lockdown for 2 months. Within 6 weeks, global container freight rates spiked 23%. Factories in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Mexico couldn't get components. A queue of 300 ships sat waiting outside the port, one port. 6 weeks, global consequences. But Shanghai, for all its scale, doesn't control the world alone. That role belongs to the city-state positioned on the narrowest choke point in maritime trade. Port 2 Singapore, the Strait of Malacca is 2.7 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Every year, roughly 100,000 vessels pass through it. That's about a quarter of all seaborne trade on Earth, including a third of the world's liquefied natural gas and half of its oil. Singapore sits right there. The Port of Singapore isn't the largest by volume, it's the most strategic. It functions as the primary transshipment hub for Southeast Asia, meaning vessels from smaller regional ports offload cargo here, which gets reloaded onto larger ships bound for Europe or North America. In 2023, Singapore handled 38.9 million TEUs, while maintaining connections to over 600 ports across 120 countries. In 2010, a Japanese research institute modeled a 30-day closure of the Strait of Malacca due to conflict. Their conclusion? Global oil prices would double within 2 weeks. Asian manufacturing would halt within a month. Estimated economic damage above $200 billion. Singapore has absorbed this study into national policy. It maintains the largest naval presence in Southeast Asia, the highest port security budget in the region, and a government that treats port continuity as an existential priority. But if Singapore guards the Eastern Gateway, there's a port on the western end of Eurasia that controls the door to an entire continent. Port 3 Rotterdam, Netherlands. Rotterdam is Europe's largest port, and has been for most of the last 100 years. It stretches 40 kilometers along the Rhine-Meuse Delta and moves roughly 500 million metric tons of cargo annually. What separates Rotterdam is geography. It sits at the mouth of the Rhine River, connecting it directly by water to Germany, Switzerland, France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. 500 million people across Europe sit within economic reach of this single port. When Russian forces invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Rotterdam became a geopolitical pressure point almost immediately. Russian oil tankers that had docked there regularly were sanctioned. LNG shipments were rerouted. Grain corridors collapsed. Rotterdam, which had processed Russian cargo worth billions annually, had to restructure its entire traffic system in a matter of weeks. It managed, but the disruption cost European businesses an estimated 8 billion euros in rerouted logistics costs in the first year alone. The lesson Rotterdam taught: ports aren't just logistics, they're political infrastructure. Lose one, and a continent loses its economic backbone. Port 4 Los Angeles, Long Beach, United States. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach sit 3 kilometers apart in San Pedro Bay. Together, they form the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere, processing roughly $300 billion in goods annually, accounting for about 40% of everything imported into the United States. In 2021, that system collapsed. At peak congestion, 109 container ships sat anchored off the California coast, waiting to unload. Some waited 40 days. The ships were carrying furniture, electronics, car parts, clothing. The goods existed, the infrastructure to process them didn't. The failure wasn't a single point of breakdown. It was a cascade. Warehouses were full, trucking companies were short on drivers, rail yards were backed up, and the port itself, designed for normal throughput, had no capacity for the surge. It took over a year for the backlog to clear. Congress allocated $17 billion for port upgrades in the 2021 Infrastructure Act, much of it directed at this complex. Construction is still underway. What the crisis exposed was something broader. American ports are the weakest link in the global supply chain. And while the US debated funding, China spent 2 decades building the infrastructure that nobody was watching. Pour 5 Jebel Ali, Dubai. When Dubai began constructing Jebel Ali in the empty desert south of the city in 1979, the project made no obvious sense. There was no industry, no established trade route, no natural hinterland, just sand and ambition. That was precisely the point. Jebel Ali is now the busiest port in the Middle East, the 9th busiest on Earth, and the largest man-made harbor ever built. It serves as the primary transshipment hub for the Indian Ocean region, connecting East Africa, South Asia, and the Persian Gulf. But the port itself is only part of the story. It's operated by DP World, a state-owned Dubai company that also controls 82 other ports across 40 countries, including stakes in Rotterdam, London, Vancouver, and Los Angeles. The Port of Dubai isn't just a port, it's a geopolitical instrument. Port 6, Busan, South Korea. Busan is the gateway to Northeast Asia. South Korea's largest port handles 23 million TEUs annually and connects Japan, China, and the Pacific Rim to global shipping routes. It also sits 50 kilometers from the most heavily militarized border on Earth. After North Korea shelled South Korea's Yampyeong Island in 2010, Seoul made a decision. Busan would be hardened. The port now has more reinforced terminal infrastructure than any other major facility in the world, backed by military logistics protocols designed for continuity under conflict conditions. The reasoning is direct. If Busan stops, South Korea's export economy, built on semiconductors, automobiles, and consumer electronics, stops with it. Port 7 Colombo, Sri Lanka. Colombo is the port most people have never heard of, which is exactly why it matters. Sri Lanka sits at the center of the Indian Ocean, directly on the shipping lanes between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. 70% of global maritime traffic passes within 200 miles of its coast. The Port of Colombo is currently the 25th busiest in the world and growing at 12% annually. China has invested heavily in its expansion through the Belt and Road Initiative. India, alarmed by that investment, has countered with its own port development partnerships. Colombo has become a proxy battleground for the next era of maritime power. In 2022, Sri Lanka's economy collapsed. Fuel shortages, debt default, mass protests. Port operations were severely disrupted for 3 weeks. Global shipping companies quietly began rerouting cargo through Singapore and Salalah. It was a small disruption by global standards, but it showed exactly how quickly the network reroutes. And what gets left behind when it does? 7 ports, 7 cities. Between them, roughly half of everything the global economy moves by sea. That concentration is not an accident. Ports require enormous capital investment, deep natural water, stable governance, and geographic access to trade routes. Those conditions exist in very few places, so trade flows toward them, and dependency accumulates. The problem is that this same concentration is the system's most dangerous vulnerability. In March 2021, a single container ship ran aground in the Suez Canal for 6 days. Not a major port, not a hub, one ship in one waterway. It delayed $9.6 billion in trade per day, while the world watched satellite images of a boat stuck sideways in a ditch. Now, scale that up. Shanghai under a 2-month lockdown, Singapore facing conflict in the Strait of Malacca, Los Angeles under a prolonged labor strike. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. All 3 have happened in some form within the last 5 years. The global shipping system is more efficient than it has ever been. It is also more fragile than it has ever been. Those 2 things are directly connected. Efficiency requires concentration. Concentration creates choke points. And choke points, by definition, are where the whole thing can break. The next time a product you ordered arrives late, or a shelf sits empty in a store, The explanation probably starts somewhere on this map, not with a company or a policy or a pandemic, with a port. And whatever happened on the water that week, these 7 locations process a staggering share of what the modern world needs to function. Most people never think about them. The people who move money between countries think about almost nothing else. The next video covers the shipping routes these ports depend on and the 3 specific choke points that could shut the whole system down. It's on screen now.